Augustus never imagined that a single morning would change his understanding of wealth, trust, and humanity. The millionaire had built an empire based on control and distrust, but a humble housekeeper was about to challenge everything he believed about loyalty. The rain beat against the enormous windows of the mansion in Beverly Hills on a gray March morning, creating a rhythmic sound that echoed through the empty corridors. Augustus Henry Morrison, at 43 years old, walked across the Italian marble floor with steps that sounded like small echoes of his own loneliness. His hands, accustomed to holding million-dollar contracts, now trembled slightly whenever he held his 3-month-old son, as if the baby were made of crystal and could shatter at the slightest abrupt movement. The pharmaceutical empire he had built over 2 decades had given him everything money could buy, but it couldn't prevent his wife Valentina from developing a rare autoimmune condition that required experimental treatment at a Swiss clinic. Her departure, 3 weeks after little Gabriel's birth, had left a void in the mansion that not even the 22 rooms could fill. Augustus had discovered, in the most brutal way possible, that there are empty spaces that no fortune can occupy. Every morning he watched from his office window as the staff arrived: the gardener who tended the 3 acres of garden, the driver who polished the fleet of cars, the cook who prepared meals he barely touched. But there was one figure that particularly caught his attention: Clara Santos, a 28-year-old woman who always arrived on the first bus of the morning, carrying a simple bag and a smile that contrasted with the hardness of someone who knows life's difficulties. Clara had been hired just 2 months ago, recommended by the cook who knew her story. Divorced, mother of a 4-month-old baby named Miguel, she divided her time between work at the mansion and small weekend jobs to supplement her income. She lived in a rented house in the nearby working-class neighborhood, where every dollar counted and where the neighbor, Mrs. Edna, watched Miguel during work hours in exchange for help with grocery shopping. What Augustus didn't know was that Clara observed every detail of the house, not just as an employee, but with the eyes of someone who understood the weight of responsibility of caring for a child alone. She saw in her boss's tired eyes the same silent desperation she felt when Miguel cried in the middle of the night, and she had to choose between her son's medicine and the electric bill. There was a universal language among solitary parents that needed no words to be understood. The house routine functioned with the precision of a Swiss mechanism. Augustus woke at 5:30, showered while listening to financial market news, checked emails arriving from London and Tokyo, and at 7 o'clock, Sharp went downstairs to find Gabriel already bathed and fed by the night nanny, who was replaced at 8 by the day nanny Simone, a 50-year-old woman with impeccable references and a resume that included families from Los Angeles high society. Simone had been recommended by a specialized agency and arrived at the house with a list of demands that included rigid schedules, specific days off, and a salary that made Augustus wonder if it wouldn't be cheaper to hire an executive director. She treated Gabriel with the efficiency of someone who had already cared for dozens of babies, but something about her mechanical approach bothered Augustus, although he couldn't identify exactly what. It was as if she saw Gabriel not as a child, but as just another item on her long list of professional responsibilities. Clara, on the other hand, whenever she passed by Gabriel's room during her cleaning, would stop for a few seconds longer than necessary. She would adjust the mobile that the window breeze had misaligned, check if the room temperature was adequate, and sometimes Augustus would catch her whispering little songs that her own mother sang when she was a child. These moments generated in the businessman a strange mixture of gratitude and discomfort, as if he were invading an intimate moment that didn't belong to him. The tension in the house increased during the week. Augustus needed to travel to Los Angeles for a series of meetings that would define the acquisition of a competing laboratory. These were negotiations that had been prepared for months, involving amounts that could double the size of his company, but could also compromise his financial stability if something went wrong. During the 3 days of his absence, he called home every 4 hours, always finding Simone with precise reports about Gabriel's activities, feeding times, sleep duration, body temperature, everything noted with the meticulousness of a medical chart. On the Wednesday of the following week, an emergency meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning. A Japanese investor, who was passing through Los Angeles, had decided to personally visit the company's facilities before signing the contract. It was the kind of opportunity that doesn't repeat itself, and Augustus knew his presence was fundamental to close the deal. He woke at 5, as always, but this time his stomach was churning with nervousness. His hands sweated while choosing his suit, and he had to redo his tie knot 3 times because his hands trembled imperceptibly. Simone arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, as always, but there was something different in her posture. She seemed irritated, checked her phone more frequently than normal, and when Gabriel started crying during a diaper change, her patience seemed to run out more quickly than usual. Augustus noticed the difference, but the tight schedule didn't allow for deeper investigations. He kissed Gabriel's forehead, gave Simone the usual instructions and left in a hurry, promising himself he would talk to the nanny about her behavior as soon as he returned. What Augustus didn't know was that Simone had received a call from her daughter the night before. She was going through a marital crisis and needed her mother to watch the grandchildren while she handled divorce paperwork. The nanny was torn between professional responsibility and family urgency, and this division began to affect her concentration and patience in a way she couldn't completely control. Clara arrived at 9 in the morning, as always, and immediately sensed the tension in the air. Simone was on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in a low voice but with an urgent tone that left no doubt about the gravity of the conversation. Gabriel was in his crib, awake but quiet, watching the colorful mobile that spun slowly above his head. Clara began cleaning on the ground floor, but her ears were attentive to any sound coming from the baby's room. Around 10:30, Simone received another call. This time she couldn't disguise the urgency in her voice. Her daughter was at the hospital with her youngest son, who had suffered a severe allergic reaction, and she needed someone to pick up the older one from school. The nanny looked at the monitor showing Gabriel sleeping peacefully and made a decision that would change the course of the entire story. She went upstairs quickly, checked that the baby was well, closed the room door and went downstairs to continue the phone conversation in the kitchen, where she could speak more freely. What should have been a 5-minute conversation extended for almost an hour. Simone's daughter was in panic. The hospital was asking for documents that were at home, and there was a series of misunderstandings that needed to be resolved over the phone. Meanwhile, Gabriel woke up, and not finding the familiar presence that always calmed him, began to cry. It was a low cry at first, almost a whimper, but it grew in intensity until it became a desperate wail that echoed throughout the entire house. Clara was on the 2nd floor, cleaning Augustus's office when she heard the first whimper. She stopped, expecting to hear Simone's footsteps going upstairs, but the sound didn't come. The crying continued, each time more intense, each time more desperate. Clara dropped the cleaning cloth and stood in the middle of the hallway, torn between the responsibility to maintain her role as housekeeper and the maternal instinct that screamed for her to do something. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Gabriel's crying was now a continuous lament that made Clara's heart race uncontrollably. Her hands began to sweat, and she felt that familiar stomach-tightening sensation she felt whenever Miguel cried, and she couldn't pick him up immediately. It was as if a child's crying activated something primitive in her brain, something she couldn't ignore no matter how much she tried to focus on other things. She went downstairs silently and peeked into the kitchen. Simone had her back turned, gesticulating nervously while talking on the phone, completely absorbed in the conversation. Clara could hear scattered words: hospital, allergy, documents, school. It was obvious that the nanny was dealing with a family emergency and had completely lost track of what was happening in the rest of the house. Clara went upstairs again, this time more quickly. Gabriel's crying now had a tone of desperation that she knew well. It was the way babies have of saying they need food, affection, attention. She stopped in front of the room door, her hand on the handle, her heart beating so hard she could hear her own pulse. She knew she was about to cross a line that could cost her job, but something greater than professional fear pushed her forward. She opened the door carefully. Gabriel was in his crib, his little face red from crying so much, his little fists clenched, his whole body writhing in discomfort. Clara approached slowly, as if she were approaching something sacred. When the baby saw her, the crying diminished slightly, as if he recognized a friendly presence, someone who understood his need. Clara picked Gabriel up with the delicacy of someone who knows the exact weight of a 3-month-old baby. He calmed down a little but remained restless, looking for something she immediately recognized. It was hunger. The baby was looking for food, and Simone was too busy to notice that feeding time had passed long ago. It was then that Clara made the decision that would change not only her life, but Augustus's perception of trust, humanity, and true value. She was still breastfeeding Miguel, who was only 1 month older than Gabriel. Her body still produced enough milk to feed both babies, something she did every day when she came home after work. She looked at Gabriel, who continued instinctively searching for food, and felt she had no choice. She sat in the armchair next to the crib, the same armchair where she had seen Valentina breastfeed Gabriel so many times before traveling. She opened her blouse with hands that trembled slightly, not from nervousness but from an emotion she couldn't name. It was as if she were participating in something greater than herself, something that connected all mothers in the world in an invisible chain of care and protection. Gabriel latched immediately, with the desperate hunger of someone who had waited longer than he should. Clara felt the familiar sensation of relief that every mother knows when she can calm a crying baby. Her heartbeat normalized, her muscles relaxed, and for the first time in a long time, she felt exactly where she should be. She began to hum softly the same song she sang to Miguel, a simple melody that her mother had taught her, that her grandmother had sung before her, and that probably her ancestors had sung to their children for generations. It was a song about protection, about love that crosses storms, about the silent strength of women who care for life even when no one is watching. Gabriel relaxed completely in her arms. His little body, which had been writhing in discomfort before, now rested confidently. His little eyes, which had closed during nursing, opened from time to time to look at Clara's face, as if he were memorizing every detail of this woman who had appeared when he needed her most. Clara couldn't stop looking at the baby. There was something about Gabriel that reminded her of Miguel, not just the similar age, but a fragility that awakened all her protective instincts. She thought about Augustus alone, trying to be father and mother at the same time, and felt a wave of empathy that surprised her. Was it possible that a man with all that wealth also felt as lost and scared as she felt every day? That's how Augustus found the scene, when he returned home 2 hours earlier than expected. The meeting had been a success beyond his expectations. The Japanese investor not only confirmed the agreement, but proposed an even broader partnership that could expand business throughout Asia. Augustus was euphoric, eager to share the news with someone when he remembered there was no one to share it with. Valentina was thousands of miles away, and Gabriel was too small to understand the meaning of that moment. He went upstairs with quick steps, wanting to check if Gabriel was well before locking himself in the office to process all the contracts that would need to be reviewed. The room door was ajar, and he pushed gently, expecting to find Simone organizing the baby's clothes or perhaps preparing the next bottle. What he saw made him stop completely. Clara was sitting in the armchair, breastfeeding Gabriel with a naturalness that seemed to have been born with her. The baby was completely relaxed, one little hand resting on Clara's arm, the other resting on his own chest. The scene had an almost pictorial quality, as if it were a modern version of a Renaissance Madonna. Augustus felt a complex mixture of emotions that he couldn't process immediately. There was surprise, obviously, but also something that resembled relief. Gabriel seemed calmer than he had been in weeks, and there was a peace in the scene that contrasted dramatically with the tension Augustus felt whenever he was alone with his son. But there was also confusion. Clara had crossed all imaginable professional boundaries. She was doing something no housekeeper should do, something that could be interpreted as invasion of privacy, violation of trust, or even something more sinister if he wanted to think that way. His first reaction was that of a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life and company. Augustus stood in the doorway for almost 2 complete minutes, watching the scene and trying to decide what his reaction should be. Clara hadn't yet noticed his presence. She was completely absorbed in the moment, humming softly, occasionally whispering words of affection that Augustus couldn't hear completely, but which were clearly directed at Gabriel. It was then that he realized Gabriel wasn't just being fed. The baby was being loved. There was a quality in Clara's affection that was different from everything Augustus had observed in Simone or the other nannies who had cared for Gabriel. It was as if she were caring for her own child, as if Gabriel were part of her family, instead of just another professional responsibility. Augustus cleared his throat discreetly. Clara immediately raised her eyes, and what he saw in her face wasn't guilt or embarrassment, but a serenity that disconcerted him. It was as if she knew exactly why she had done what she did, and was at peace with her decision, regardless of the consequences. She began to get up as if to explain or apologize, but Augustus gestured with his hand, asking her to stay where she was. There was something in the scene he didn't want to interrupt, something that was working in a way he couldn't explain rationally. Gabriel was still nursing, completely oblivious to the tension between the adults, lost in his own world of satisfaction and security. Augustus entered the room silently and stood by the window, watching. There were questions that needed to be asked, explanations that needed to be given, but at that moment he felt incapable of breaking the tranquility he had found. It was the first time in months he had seen Gabriel so relaxed, so genuinely at peace. Clara finished breastfeeding and lifted Gabriel so he could burp, supporting him against her shoulder and giving gentle pats on his back with a technique that made it clear she knew exactly what she was doing. Augustus observed every movement, noticing there was a naturalness in her actions that none of the professional nannies had demonstrated. It wasn't just technical competence. It was pure maternal instinct. When Gabriel burped and settled sleepily against Clara's shoulder, she placed him back in the crib with care that bordered on reverent. She covered him with the light blanket, checked if the room temperature was adequate, and only then turned to face Augustus. The two looked at each other for a long moment. Clara was clearly expecting a reprimand, perhaps even immediate dismissal. Her hands were intertwined in front of her body, and she kept her head raised with a dignity that impressed Augustus. There was no submission in her posture, but also no defiance. It was as if she were ready to accept the consequences of her actions because she knew she had done the right thing. Augustus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There were so many things that needed to be said, so many issues that needed to be clarified, but he found himself completely speechless. The scene he had witnessed challenged all his preconceived notions about professional boundaries, about trust, about the nature of relationships between employers and employees. It was then that Simone appeared in the doorway, still with the phone in her hand, clearly agitated by the conversation she had had. She stopped abruptly upon seeing Augustus and Clara in the room, and her gaze immediately went to Gabriel, who was sleeping peacefully in his crib. The expression on her face changed from confusion to understanding, and then to something that resembled indignation. Simone had immediately perceived what had happened. The fact that Gabriel was sleeping peacefully, the fact that Clara was in the room, the slightly defensive posture of the two adults. She connected the dots quickly and concluded that Clara had assumed responsibilities that weren't hers during her absence. The nanny approached the crib to check on Gabriel, as if wanting to make sure he was well, but there was something in her movements that suggested she was more worried about her own position in the house than the baby's welfare. When she turned to face Augustus and Clara, there was a tension in her face that hadn't existed before. Augustus immediately perceived the change in the room's atmosphere. What had been a moment of peace and reflection transformed into something tense and charged with implications. He looked at Clara, who had taken a step back, clearly uncomfortable with Simone's arrival. Then he looked at the nanny, who seemed to be preparing for some kind of confrontation. The situation was about to complicate in ways none of the three could completely predict. Augustus knew he needed to make a decision about how to handle what had happened, but he also knew that his choice at that moment would define not only Clara and Simone's future in the house, but also his own understanding of what really mattered when it came to caring for a child. He looked once more at Gabriel, who slept serenely, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. The baby seemed more peaceful than Augustus had seen him in weeks, and that was a fact he couldn't ignore, regardless of the professional or social implications of what had happened. The silence in the room extended for a few more seconds, until Augustus finally found his voice. When he spoke, his words were carefully measured, but there was a firmness in them that made it clear he had made a decision, even if he didn't yet know completely what all the ramifications of that choice would be. Augustus asked Simone to wait in the living room, as he needed to talk to Clara first. The nanny hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable leaving the two alone, but the authority in Augustus's voice left no room for questioning. She left the room, but not before casting a look at Clara that carried a mixture of censure and something that resembled envy. When they were alone again, Augustus approached the window and stood watching the garden for a few moments, organizing his thoughts. Clara remained standing beside the crib, her hands still slightly trembling, but her posture maintaining the dignity she had shown from the beginning. Augustus finally turned to her and asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he had witnessed the scene. He wanted to know not only why she had done what she did, but how she had known Gabriel needed to be fed, where Simone was during all that time, and more importantly, how she felt about having crossed such a clear line between her professional responsibilities and something much more personal. Clara responded with honesty that completely disarmed him. She explained about Gabriel's prolonged crying, about her initial attempt to ignore the situation, about Simone's absence, and finally about the decision she had made. She didn't try to justify her actions with excuses or rationalizations. She simply said there was a child needing care, and she was in a position to provide that care, so she did. Augustus listened to every word, observing not only what she said, but how she said it. There was a sincerity in her voice that was impossible to fake, an authenticity that contrasted dramatically with the rehearsed explanations he was used to hearing in the corporate world. Clara was speaking with her heart, not with the calculating mind of someone trying to protect their job. When she finished speaking, Augustus realized he had learned more about Clara in 5 minutes than he had learned about Simone in several weeks. There was a depth in her motivations that went far beyond professional responsibility. It was as if she saw Gabriel not as her employer's son, but as a child who needed care, period. But there were practical questions that needed to be addressed. Augustus needed to understand if Clara had experience with babies, if she was breastfeeding her own child, if there were health risks involved in her decision. These weren't questions he was comfortable asking, but they were necessary if he wanted to make an informed decision about how to proceed. Clara answered each question with the same direct honesty. Yes, she had a 4-month-old son. Yes, she was still breastfeeding. Yes, she had considered the risks and had decided that leaving Gabriel crying from hunger was a greater risk than anything else. Her answers were simple, direct, without unnecessary elaboration. Augustus found himself in a position he had never imagined being in. All his notions about professional hierarchy, about appropriate boundaries, about the nature of work relationships, were being challenged by a situation that didn't exist in any human resources manual. He was dealing with emotional and ethical territories that his years of business experience hadn't prepared him to navigate. He looked once more at Gabriel, who continued sleeping peacefully, and made a decision that surprised him. Instead of taking immediate action, he told Clara he needed time to process what had happened. He asked her to continue her work normally and promised to talk with her again at the end of the day, after he had the opportunity to think about the situation with more clarity. Clara nodded and left the room, leaving Augustus alone with Gabriel and his own thoughts. He approached the crib and watched his son sleeping. There was something different in the baby's expression, a tranquility he hadn't noticed before. Was it possible that Gabriel had really benefited from Clara's care in a way that went beyond simple nutrition? During the rest of the afternoon, Augustus found himself observing Clara differently. He noticed how she interacted with all elements of the house, how she treated the other staff with respect and kindness, how she cared for even the smallest details of cleaning and organization. There was a quality in her attention that was different from any employee he had ever had. It was as if she really cared about the house and the people who lived in it. He also observed Simone more attentively. The nanny had resumed her duties with Gabriel, but there was a tension in her movements that hadn't existed before. She seemed to be striving to demonstrate her professional competence, but there was something forced in her actions, as if she were playing the role of perfect nanny instead of simply being one. During dinner, which Augustus ate alone in the dining room that could accommodate 20 people, he found himself thinking about family, about care, about what it really means to protect and nurture a child. He had grown up in a house where these functions were delegated to professionals, where love was demonstrated through material provision instead of physical and emotional presence. But seeing Clara with Gabriel, he had witnessed something different. He had seen care that came from the heart, not from professional duty. He had seen someone who reacted to a need not because she was paid to do so, but because it was human to do so. And he had seen Gabriel respond to this type of care in a way that was clearly different from his response to professional care, however competent it might be. That night, after all the staff had gone home and the house was silent, Augustus went upstairs to check on Gabriel before going to sleep. He found Simone sitting beside the crib, reading a magazine, clearly fulfilling her obligation of nighttime surveillance. Gabriel was sleeping, but there was a restlessness in his sleep that Augustus had grown accustomed to seeing, but which had been absent during the afternoon. Augustus briefly talked with Simone about the day's events. The nanny was careful with her words, but made it clear she considered Clara's actions inappropriate and potentially dangerous. She mentioned issues of legal responsibility, appropriate, professional boundaries, dangerous precedents that could be established if such actions were tolerated. All of Simone's concerns were valid from a professional standpoint. She was right to point out that Clara had crossed important boundaries, that she had assumed responsibilities that weren't hers, that she had created a situation that could have legal complications if something had gone wrong. From a risk management perspective, Clara's actions were indefensible, but from a human perspective, things were more complicated. Augustus couldn't forget the peace he had seen in Gabriel's face, the naturalness with which Clara had cared for him, the absolute sincerity in her explanations. There was something about the whole situation that challenged his typical approach of risk versus benefit analysis. During the following days, Augustus began to pay more attention to the house dynamics. He noticed that Gabriel seemed more agitated, on days when Clara wasn't present, as if the baby had developed some kind of recognition and preference for her presence. In moments when Clara passed by the room during her cleaning, Gabriel would follow her with his eyes, something he didn't do with Simone or the other staff. Augustus also began to observe Simone's behavior more closely. The nanny was competent, punctual, followed all established protocols, but there was a mechanical coldness in her interactions with Gabriel that became more evident each day. It was as if she saw the baby as a professional responsibility to be fulfilled instead of a small child who needed affection beyond basic care. On Friday of that week, Augustus decided to conduct a test. He cancelled a meeting and spent the morning at home, discreetly observing the routines. He saw Simone feed Gabriel efficiently, change his diaper with technical competence, put him to sleep following exactly the established schedule. But there were no moments of spontaneous affection, no whispered conversations, nothing that suggested she saw Gabriel as anything more than a professional obligation. When Clara arrived for work, the difference was immediate. Even focused on her cleaning tasks, she checked on Gabriel whenever she passed by his room. If he was awake, she made little faces that made him smile. If he was crying, she whispered words of comfort, even knowing Simone would soon appear. There was a naturalness in her interactions that contrasted dramatically with the professional but cold approach of the nanny. The decisive moment came the following Monday. Augustus had scheduled an important video conference with European investors at 2 in the afternoon, a time that coincided with Gabriel's nap. Simone had positioned herself in the adjacent room, from where she could hear any sound from the baby, while Augustus prepared for the virtual meeting in his office. 20 minutes after the conference began, Gabriel woke up crying. It was a different cry than usual, more intense, more desperate. Augustus heard it through the monitor, but kept focus on the meeting, trusting that Simone would resolve the situation quickly. The investors were presenting crucial numbers for European expansion, and his full attention was necessary. But the crying continued. 5 minutes became 10, 10 became 15. Augustus began to get distracted, missing important parts of the presentation. He could hear Simone trying to calm Gabriel, but clearly without success. The baby seemed inconsolable, and the crying was becoming increasingly desperate. Augustus excused himself from the meeting and quickly left the office. He found Simone in Gabriel's room, clearly frustrated and somewhat desperate. She had tried bottle feeding, diaper change, position change, but nothing worked. Gabriel continued crying with an intensity that made Augustus's heart race with worry. It was then that Clara appeared in the doorway, clearly hesitant. She had finished cleaning the ground floor and gone upstairs to continue her work when she heard the crying. She had stood in the doorway for several minutes, torn between the desire to help and the fear of again crossing professional boundaries she had already crossed once. Augustus looked at Simone, then at Clara, then at Gabriel, who continued crying desperately. Something inside him made a decision that his rational mind was still processing. He asked Simone to leave the room and gestured for Clara to approach. Clara picked Gabriel up with the same naturalness as before. The baby calmed almost immediately, as if he recognized not only her touch but her emotional presence. She cradled him against her chest, whispering the same words of affection she had used before, and Gabriel relaxed completely in her arms. Augustus observed the transformation with a mixture of relief and understanding that surprised him. It wasn't just about feeding or care technique. Gabriel had developed an emotional connection with Clara that went beyond any professional protocol. It was a connection that seemed to meet a need of the babies that neither Augustus nor Simone had been able to identify. At that moment, Augustus made a decision that would permanently change the dynamics of his house. He told Clara he wanted to talk to her about a change in her responsibilities. It wasn't a promotion in the traditional sense, but a recognition that Gabriel needed something that only she was providing. The conversation that took place that afternoon was different from any negotiation Augustus had conducted in his business career. It wasn't about contracts or benefits or formal job descriptions. It was about recognizing a human connection that had developed organically and finding a way to honor it officially. Clara listened to Augustus's proposal with a mixture of surprise and caution. She had grown accustomed to the idea that her gesture of affection could cost her job, as though the suggestion that it could lead to an expansion of her responsibilities was almost impossible to process initially. Augustus explained that he wanted her to officially take on part of Gabriel's care, working together with a new nanny who would be hired for night shifts. It would be an unusual arrangement, but one that recognized the reality of what was working best for Gabriel. Clara would have formal responsibilities for the baby in addition to her cleaning duties, and would be compensated adequately for both functions. Clara's hesitation wasn't about money or opportunity. It was about the enormity of the responsibility being offered. Caring for another person's child wasn't just a job. It was a sacred responsibility that required a level of dedication and care that went far beyond any formal job description. But when she looked at Gabriel, who had fallen asleep in her arms during the conversation, Clara knew her answer was already decided. There was something about that baby that had touched her heart in a way she couldn't explain rationally. It was as if Gabriel needed her as much as she needed the opportunity to care for him. The conversation with Simone was more difficult. The nanny was clearly upset with what she saw as a devaluation of her professional competence. She had cared for dozens of babies throughout her career and had never faced a situation where she was considered inadequate for a child's needs. Augustus was careful to explain that it wasn't a matter of professional competence, but of personal fit. Some babies develop preferences for specific caregivers, and Gabriel had clearly developed a special connection with Clara. It wasn't a reflection of Simone's skills, but simply a reality that needed to be respected for Gabriel's well-being. Simone accepted the explanation with professional grace, but there was a coldness in her farewell that made it clear she saw the situation as an injustice. She had followed all protocols, had been competent and reliable, but had been replaced by someone whose main qualification was an instinctive emotional connection with the child. The transition was smoother than Augustus had anticipated. Clara officially took on daytime care of Gabriel, while a new night nanny was hired for sleep shifts. The baby flourished under the new arrangement, becoming more smiling, more interactive, more relaxed overall. Augustus began to notice changes in himself too. Seeing Clara care for Gabriel with such natural affection, he began to relax his own anxieties about fatherhood. She taught him small consoling techniques, shared observations about Gabriel's behavioral patterns, and gradually helped Augustus feel more confident in his role as a father. The weeks passed, and a comfortable routine was established. Clara divided her time between caring for Gabriel and her cleaning responsibilities, but there was a natural integration between the two functions that made everything seem to flow organically. Gabriel was clearly thriving, and Augustus felt more relaxed and confident as a father than he had felt since the baby's birth. It was during this period of stability that Augustus began to notice other aspects of Clara's personality that had gone unnoticed before. He observed how careful she was with every detail of the house, how she treated the other staff with respect and kindness, how she managed her own time and responsibilities with an efficiency that rivaled any executive he knew. One morning, while working in his office, Augustus heard Clara humming while cleaning the adjacent room. It was the same melody she sang to Gabriel, a simple song that had a hypnotic and calming quality. Augustus found himself stopping work just to listen, feeling a tranquility he hadn't experienced in months. It was then that he began to understand that Clara had brought something to his house that went far beyond competent care for Gabriel. She had brought a quality of affection and attention that was transforming the atmosphere of the entire residence. The house felt more like a home and less like an empty mansion echoing with loneliness. Augustus began to observe Clara more attentively, not as an employer watching an employee, but as a man trying to understand what kind of person could bring so much peace and affection to an environment. He noticed how she never wasted anything, how she cared for the house objects as if they were hers, how she interacted with Gabriel not just with competence, but with genuine joy. One afternoon, while Clara was preparing Gabriel for a nap, Augustus entered the room and sat in the chair beside the crib. It was something he had begun to do regularly, not out of need for supervision, but because he enjoyed watching the interaction between Clara and Gabriel. There was something almost meditative about the experience. During one of these moments, Clara began talking about her own son, Miguel. She described how difficult it was to balance work with motherhood, how she constantly worried if she was making the right decisions, how sometimes she felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising a child alone. Augustus listened with attention that surprised him. There was something about Clara's honesty that made him want to share his own insecurities about fatherhood. He found himself talking about his fears of not being a good father to Gabriel, about the guilt he felt over Valentina's absence, about the loneliness of making important parenting decisions alone. It was the first real conversation Augustus had had about fatherhood since Valentina had left for treatment. There was something liberating about being able to express his concerns to someone who clearly understood the challenges of being a single parent, even if their circumstances were completely different. Clara listened without judgment, occasionally offering observations or suggestions based on her own experience. There was a practical wisdom in her advice that contrasted with the theoretical parenting guides Augustus had tried to read. It was knowledge born from real experience, tempered by necessity and refined by love. These conversations became a regular part of their interactions. They weren't formal or structured, but arose naturally during Gabriel's care moments. Augustus began to value these exchanges as much as any important business meeting. There was a substance to them that nourished a part of himself he had neglected for years. It was during one of these conversations that Clara casually mentioned that she sometimes skipped meals to ensure Miguel had enough food. She said this without self-pity, just as a fact of life, but Augustus was deeply disturbed by the revelation. The idea that Clara was depriving herself of basic necessities while caring so well for Gabriel and his house was like a punch to the stomach. Augustus tried to approach the subject delicately, offering financial help beyond her salary, but Clara politely refused. She explained that she had accepted the responsibility of raising Miguel alone and was determined to do so with dignity. She didn't want charity, even if offered with the best intentions. Clara's refusal frustrated Augustus in a way he couldn't completely explain. He was used to solving problems with money, to using his resources to improve difficult situations. The discovery that there were problems money couldn't solve, or at least not in the direct way he was accustomed to, was a disturbing revelation. Augustus began looking for creative ways to help Clara without hurting her pride. He significantly increased her salary, justifying the increase with her expanded responsibilities with Gabriel. He began providing meals during her work shift, arguing it was more convenient for everyone if she had her meals at the house. Small gestures that allowed Clara to accept help without feeling she was receiving charity. Clara accepted these changes graciously, clearly understanding what Augustus was trying to do, but maintaining her dignity in the process. There was a delicate dance between them, a mutual respect that allowed Augustus to express his gratitude and care without making Clara feel diminished or dependent. During this period, Augustus began to realize he was learning as much about fatherhood and humanity through his observation of Clara as Gabriel was learning through her care. There were lessons about priorities, about sacrifice, about the difference between material provision and emotional care that were transforming his understanding of what really mattered in life. The situation became complicated when Renata, Augustus's sister, made a surprise visit to the house. Renata was a sophisticated woman who had married a diplomat and lived a life of social privileges in Washington, D.C. She had come to meet Gabriel and evaluate how Augustus was handling solo fatherhood. Renata immediately noticed the closeness between Clara and Gabriel, and her reaction was one of poorly disguised disapproval. She questioned Augustus about the appropriateness of allowing a domestic worker to have so much involvement in Gabriel's care. Her concerns were presented as being about appropriate professional boundaries, but there was an undertone of class prejudice that made Augustus feel uncomfortable. The tension increased when Renata witnessed Clara breastfeeding Gabriel during one of her visits. Renata's reaction was one of shock and barely contained indignation. She confronted Augustus about what she saw as a grotesque violation of appropriate boundaries, questioning his competence as a father for allowing such a situation. Augustus found himself in a defensive position he hadn't anticipated. He tried to explain the circumstances that had led to the current arrangement, but Renata wasn't interested in nuances or context. For her, there was only a matter of social adequacy, and what was happening in his house was clearly inadequate. The confrontation escalated when Renata threatened to tell other family members about the situation, suggesting that Augustus needed external supervision to make appropriate decisions about Gabriel's care. There was an implicit threat that she could legally question his ability to raise Gabriel alone if he didn't make immediate changes. Augustus felt pressured in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He was used to making complex business decisions under pressure, but this was different. It was his family questioning his competence as a father, using Gabriel as an emotional weapon to force him to conform to their social expectations. That night, after Renata had gone to the hotel, Augustus stayed awake thinking about the situation. He mentally reviewed all aspects of his arrangement with Clara, trying to see if there was something that really justified his sister's concerns. But every time he thought about Gabriel, about how the baby had thrived under Clara's care, about how he himself had felt more confident as a father, he came to the same conclusion. What was happening in his house might not be conventional, but it was working. Gabriel was healthy, happy, and clearly loved. Augustus was learning to be a better father. Clara was being respected and adequately compensated for her exceptional work. It was a situation that benefited everyone involved, even if it didn't fit traditional social expectations. The next day, Augustus had a frank conversation with Renata. He explained that he had carefully considered all aspects of the situation and had decided that Gabriel's well-being was his absolute priority. If that meant challenging social conventions, then he was prepared to do that. Renata was visibly upset with his decision, but Augustus maintained his position with a firmness that surprised him. It was the first time in his life he had put his own values above his family's expectations, and there was something liberating about the experience, even if it was accompanied by anxiety about social consequences. The real crisis came a few weeks later, when Augustus needed to travel to an international conference in Miami. It was a crucial event for his company, with potential to open new markets in Latin America. He had planned to take Gabriel with him, but the baby developed a low fever that made travel inadvisable. Augustus found himself in an impossible position. Canceling the trip would mean losing business opportunities that had been cultivated for months. But leaving sick Gabriel with an unknown nanny was unthinkable. It was then that Clara offered a solution that would permanently change the dynamics of their relationship. Clara suggested she could bring Miguel to the house and care for both babies during Augustus's absence. It would be a solution that would ensure Gabriel had continuous family care while allowing Augustus to attend to his professional responsibilities. But it would also be a definitive test of trust between them. Clara's proposal forced Augustus to confront questions about trust, responsibility, and the nature of their relationship that he had been avoiding. Leaving Gabriel in Clara's care during his absence would be a demonstration of absolute trust. But it would also be recognition that Clara had become more than an employee. She had become part of Gabriel's family in a way that was difficult to define formally. Augustus spent days considering the proposal, weighing risks and benefits with the meticulousness he applied to the most important business decisions. But in the end, his decision was based not on rational analysis but on instinct. Gabriel was clearly more comfortable with Clara than he had been with anyone else besides Augustus. If something were to happen to the baby, he wanted it to be with someone who genuinely cared about his well-being. The week Augustus spent in Miami was transformative in ways he hadn't anticipated. Knowing that Gabriel was well cared for allowed him to concentrate completely on his business for the first time in months. He closed important deals, established valuable partnerships, and returned with contracts that would significantly expand his company. But more important than any professional success was the realization that he had found a solution to one of his life's biggest challenges. He had discovered a way to be a present father and successful businessman simultaneously, not through compartmentalization, but through genuine trust in people who shared his values and priorities. When Augustus returned from Miami, he found a house that was functioning like it never had before. Gabriel was healthy and happy. Clara was radiant with confirmation that her approach to care was being valued, and the entire atmosphere of the house reflected a harmony he didn't know was possible. It was during his first night back that Augustus realized how much his perspective had changed. He was sitting in Gabriel's room, watching Clara prepare the baby for sleep, when he realized he was no longer watching an employee doing her job. He was watching someone who had become essential to his family's well-being. The revelation was accompanied by a wave of gratitude that surprised him with its intensity. Clara had appeared in his life at a moment of desperate need and had provided not only competent care for Gabriel, but a perspective on family and priorities that was transforming his understanding of what really mattered. Augustus made a decision that night that represented a complete break with his previous approaches to professional relationships. He decided he wanted to formalize Clara's position in his family in a way that recognized not only her professional value, but her personal importance to Gabriel and to himself. The conversation that took place the next day was different from any other Augustus had had in his life. It wasn't a contract negotiation or a benefits discussion. It was a mutual recognition that they had developed a relationship that transcended traditional categories of employer and employee. Augustus offered Clara a benefits package that included not only substantial salary increase, but also complete health insurance for her and Miguel, educational assistance, and a savings fund that would guarantee long-term financial stability. But more important than any material benefit was his formal recognition that Clara had become part of Gabriel's family. Clara listened to the proposal with tears in her eyes, not from gratitude for the benefits offered, but from recognition. For the first time in her adult life, someone had valued not only her work but her person. Someone had recognized that her contributions went beyond specific tasks to include human qualities that couldn't be quantified or contracted. Clara's acceptance marked the beginning of a new phase in their lives. Gabriel continued to thrive under their combined care, but now there was security and stability in the entire arrangement that benefited everyone involved. Clara could focus on her work without constant financial worries, and Augustus could pursue his professional ambitions, knowing Gabriel was receiving the kind of loving care he wanted for his son. Months later, when Valentina returned from her treatment in Switzerland, she found a situation that was completely different from what she had left. Gabriel had grown and developed under Clara's care, and there was a bond between them that was impossible to ignore. More surprising still, there was a peace and contentment in Augustus that she hadn't seen in years. Valentina needed time to process all the changes that had occurred in her absence. Her expectations about how she would find her family were challenged by the reality of discovering that her husband and son had developed a new family dynamic that included Clara as an essential member. The adaptation wasn't without challenges. Valentina had to recognize that Clara had occupied a maternal space in Gabriel's life that she herself hadn't been able to fill before leaving. There was natural jealousy, but also gratitude for knowing Gabriel had been loved and cared for in her absence. Clara, in turn, needed to navigate the delicate transition from being the primary maternal figure in Gabriel's life to supporting Gabriel's reunification with his biological mother. It was a process that required emotional maturity and generosity that impressed both Augustus and Valentina. The arrangement that finally established itself was unique but functional. Clara maintained her crucial role in Gabriel's care, but now worked in collaboration with Valentina, who was gradually reassuming her maternal role. It was an expanded family that challenged traditional definitions, but was clearly working for everyone involved. The impact of the experience extended far beyond the immediate family. Augustus discovered that his priorities had fundamentally changed. Although he continued being a successful businessman, he now made decisions based on how they would affect his ability to be present for Gabriel. Money and status were important, but no longer more important than family and genuine relationships. Clara had discovered it was possible to be valued not only for the work she did, but for the person she was. The experience had given her confidence to establish appropriate boundaries, demand respect, and seek opportunities that recognized her total value as a human being. Gabriel, obviously, was the biggest beneficiary of the entire situation. He had grown up surrounded by adults who genuinely cared about his well-being, who made decisions based on love instead of convenience, and who had created an environment where he could thrive emotionally as well as physically. The story became known in their social circles, generating mixed reactions. Some saw Augustus as someone who had lost perspective on appropriate boundaries. Others admired him for prioritizing his son's well-being above social conventions. But for Augustus, external opinions had become irrelevant. He had learned to make decisions based on his own values instead of social expectations. Years later, when Gabriel was beginning to talk, one of his first words was Clara. It wasn't a surprise to anyone in the family. Clara had been present for every important milestone in his development, had been a constant source of love and care, had helped shape the person he was becoming. For Augustus, hearing Gabriel speak Clara's name was confirmation of all the decisions he had made. He had chosen to follow his instinct about what was best for his son, even when that challenged social conventions. The result was a family that was stronger, more loving, and more authentic than anything he could have imagined years before. The deepest lesson Augustus had learned was that true wealth isn't measured in financial terms, but in the quality of relationships we build and maintain. Clara had entered his life as an employee, but had become an essential part of his family through actions that came from the heart, not from contractual obligations. The legacy of the entire experience was a redefinition of family that included not only blood ties, but ties of choice and love. Gabriel would grow up knowing that family are the people who choose to be present, who genuinely care, who make sacrifices for love instead of obligation. For Clara, the experience had proven that dignity and respect can be found even in the most unlikely circumstances. She had discovered that her value as a person wasn't determined by her social position or financial situation, but by her capacity to love, care for, and contribute to others' well-being. Augustus's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. He had started as a man who believed money could solve any problem, and that professional relationships should maintain rigid boundaries. He discovered that some of life's most valuable gifts come from authentic human connections that transcend social or professional categories. What had begun as a childcare crisis had become a journey of discovery about values, priorities, and the true nature of family. It was a story about how acts of kindness can transform lives, about how courage to challenge conventions can lead to extraordinary results, and about how genuine love always finds a way to prevail. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on the importance of kindness and genuine gestures in our lives, leave a like and share with someone special. Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most and how you show affection for the important people in your life. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for more stories that celebrate the strength of human love and the beauty of small gestures that transform the world. Your presence here makes all the difference.